Hi everybody, welcome back to the Gilbert F. Stansel Musical Instrument Museum here at Blue Lake Fine Arts Camp. My name is Dave Bower and I'm the curator of the museum. You know, if you've been in here and heard me give a presentation, or if you've seen some of these videos this summer, you'll have heard me talk about how musical instruments generally developed over a very long period of time. From the very earliest simple, very basic examples and to the modern instruments that we have today that are incredibly mechanically and musically sophisticated. And that tends to be the rule, this gradual improvement of musical instruments over a long period of time. But with every rule, there's an exception. And there's one family of instruments, acoustic instruments, in our Western band and orchestral instrument tradition that's the exception to that rule, and that's the saxophone family. This is a beautiful alto saxophone in the collection, and I studied saxophone for a little while, and I can still remember that C major scale. Never mind the bad rhythm there. Now, Adolphe Sax was a brilliant instrument builder during his lifetime. And he began with instruments like the flute and the clarinet, and he developed a vastly improved bass clarinet that was one of the final steps until we get to the modern bass clarinet. And he also made brass instruments like this monster right here. This is called a Sax Horn, and there are different sizes of these instruments, and they're still used in military and brass bands today. And Sax also was one of the manufacturers that helped to get us to the modern piston valves that we all know of in modern brass instruments. He didn't quite invent this particular type of piston valves, but he made significant improvements and got us almost to the modern valves that we have today. But he began to get the idea for the saxophone in the mid-1830s, and he received the patent on the instrument in 1846. He originally envisioned both band and orchestral families of saxophones. The band instruments were the ones that we know of today that are in B flat and E flat, and in the modern concert band we see alto, tenor, and baritone saxophone most often. But he also envisioned an orchestral family of saxophones that would be pitched in C and F. And that particular family of saxophones didn't catch on very well. There was essentially one exception to that. There was a tenor saxophone pitched in the key of C, which was also called the C melody saxophone. And in early jazz, that was used by saxophone players. And since it was pitched in the key of C, the sax player could look over the shoulder of the pianist and play off of the same music. But as Sax was developing this instrument, basically all of the development and all of the evolution of this instrument was compacted into a very short period of time, and it all happened inside of his head and in his workshop. But to say that he invented the instrument doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't influenced by other instruments. For example, when we talk about the modern flute, you may remember that we talked about how a German flute-playing silversmith named Theobald Boehm received the patent for the fingering system for the flute in 1850. Well, as Sax was working on the saxophone, he basically modified an earlier version of the Boehm fingering system for the saxophone. In addition, he knew that this instrument was going to be conical in shape, which means that the tubing is smaller at one end than it is at the other, and as you went along, that the keys were actually, the holes on the side of the instruments for the keys were going to get larger. And you needed some way to cover up those holes because the tips of your fingers weren't going to do it. So he needed to find some kind of a key system. And he got that system from an extremely interesting instrument, this one here, that is called an ophicleide. And it's essentially an ancestor of the modern tuba. And as you can see, it has very similar looking keys on it. And so these keys had a big round metal part and then a pad underneath to close the hole. It didn't work nearly so well on the ophicleide. In fact, it's not the greatest sounding instrument ever. But what Sax was able to do was he was able to take this particular key system and modify it for the saxophone. So when we talk about the saxophone these days, what we're talking about is an instrument that was essentially invented rather than developing over a very long period of time. If you come into the museum the next time you're here, you'll see that we have a pretty complete family of saxophones. We're only missing the very smallest one that's called a Sopranino, and we're also missing the one that's even larger than the bass saxophone on the end there. It's called a contrabass saxophone, and if we had one in the museum, it would probably go from about the floor to the ceiling. The other one that we are missing is one that is extremely rare. It's a baritone saxophone that's pitched in F, and it was part of that orchestral family of saxophones. We look forward to seeing all of you back here in 2021. We hope that you're well and safe. Please keep an eye on our social media pages this summer for more really interesting and fun content. And thanks for watching this virtual arts video brought to you by Blue Lake Fine Arts Camp. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.